Now we're going to look at how hormones work, right? So how does a hormone work? So you remember, the two most important thing when we look at a hormone is it requires two things. It requires a ligand or a hormone, and in pink, and then it requires a receptor in order to bind to that specific selective receptor in order to generate a response, right? So all hormones, in order to create an actual physiological change, require the ligand and the receptor that's present, right? And so these two combining create some kind of response, right? So what if there's multiple hormones, right? So there's differences, right? So there's hormones that are permissive, there's hormones that are synergistic, and there's hormones that are antagonistic of each other. And they're important whenever you're thinking about the actual activation of these hormones, right? So if we look at the first example we talked about, is permissive. So what does permissive mean? So permissive means that this hormone requires another hormone in order to be active, right? So its actual effect cannot be exerted, right? So its effect of the actual response that is being created cannot be exerted unless that other hormone is present, right? So an example of this would be reproductive hormones. So reproductive hormones require thyroid hormones. So reproductive hormones, for example, testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone, they also require thyroid hormones. So T3, T4, thyroxine hormone, require regulation of metabolism in order for this actual response to work. If there is a problem with this thyroid hormone that's present, these reproductive hormones will not be able to generate their actual responses, and so in the end, these hormones do not actually stimulate anything, right? So this is an example of permissive. Another example that we talked about was synergistic. Synergistic. So what does synergistic mean? So synergistic means whenever another hormone is present, this amplifies that response, right? So you have an amplification of that response that is present. So an example of this is, for example, during a sympathetic response, you have a secretion of epinephrine, right? And glucagon. So epinephrine's main function, when we look at if we want to increase blood sugar levels, right? If we want to increase blood sugar levels, epinephrine plays as a secondary messenger, if you remember, in activating the downstream proteins, protein kinase A, in order to allow for the increased release of glucose, and also glucagon. So glucagon is another hormone secreted from your pancreas. Remember which region? The alpha cells in the islet of Langerhans, which is responsible for increasing blood sugar levels, right? So this is an example of a synergistic approach. And then finally, when we look at the final thing we talked about was antagonistic. So antagonistic means they do opposites of each other. They don't help each other. They inhibit each other, right? So if they inhibit each other, that becomes not necessarily a problem, right? But it helps with the actual regulation of it. So a perfect example here would be insulin and glucagon, right? So insulin, which cells were they secreted from the pancreas? Do you remember? Beta cells are antagonistic with glucagon, right? Because insulin's main function is to decrease blood sugar levels, so decrease G, whereas glucagon's responsibility is to increase glucagon, right? So these are antagonistic hormones, right? And so this is just a nice little example of these three different mechanisms when there's multiple hormones being present.